Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. So in between my time working for the bank and my time working in county government, I worked with some folks who were helping a municipality with some land use issues. When I joined the group, my role was to assist in drafting documents and ordinances. But as the project evolved, I wound up being the face of the group. I would make the presentations at municipal meetings, meet with residents, and arrange and attend meetings with county and local and state officials as needed. Another aspect of that role in the project meant dealing with the media. Up until then, my dealings with the press had been infrequent and not with me serving in any kind of an official capacity. Now I spoke on behalf of our group, and in some cases, on behalf of the municipal officials. Now, I don't know who said it, and even Google isn't quite sure, but I remembered the saying about not picking a fight with the person that buys ink by the barrel. So I set out to build a positive relationship with the reporter covering the municipality we were working with. If she called and left a message, I made sure to return her calls. I provided her with any information I could to help her with her stories. I didn't always get the coverage I wanted, but I always had the opportunity to present our side of an issue. That experience taught me some valuable lessons I used when I accepted the position as manager of Warwicksburg Borough. Some of my colleagues would not answer reporters' questions in person or over the phone. They insisted that questions be emailed to them, and they would only answer by emailing back a reply. Well, I took a different approach. I made sure reporters covering the borough had my office phone number and my cell phone number, and I stressed with them that they could call me anytime they had a question. See, I would much rather a question be answered than to read something that wasn't quite right in an article in the next morning's newspaper. And Debbie can tell you there was many a Wednesday night, the second Wednesday of the month, where late in the evening I was still on the phone with a reporter long after the council meeting had come to an end. But an interesting thing happened as I continued in my time with the borough. Reporters would be calling me looking for stories. What's going on in your town? What can we cover? Knowing that there were slow news days when they needed stories, I would send them information on upcoming events or activities going on in the community. It would help the reporter complete an assignment and generate publicity for the community. Well, as I was reading this morning's gospel and the commentaries, I was reminded of another time when the relationship with the press proved beneficial. It wasn't something to promote an event, but something far more serious. One Sunday, a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, as I was enjoying fellowship at Salem United Methodist Church, our church's representative to the Warwicksburg Food Pantry Board walked up to me and said, "Mike, the pantry is out of food. In 2 weeks, there are going to be around 100 families there looking for food for a November distribution." Now, I don't remember if I called the reporter or she called me, but sometime Monday I had a conversation with a reporter that went something like this: "I have a story for you. Our food pantry is out of food. In 2 weeks, they're going to have a distribution. They're expecting 100 families, which for our food pantry was a significant number of families." I provided her the contact information for the couple who oversaw the food pantry and went on with what I was doing. A couple days later, there was an article in the paper about the lack of food at the food pantry, complete with a couple of photographs of the empty shelves to emphasize the point. A week later, the folks at the food pantry were looking for space to store all the food that had come in. Because just like in this morning's gospel, from that scarcity came abundance. So our text opens this morning with Jesus going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee with a large crowd following him because of the signs he was doing for the sick. Now, signs is a word unique to John's gospel. For John, signs point to a reality beyond themselves. They crack open heaven just a little bit so us earthbound folks get a glimpse of God's truth. So starting with the wedding feast at Cana, Jesus has been providing glimpses of godly truth to those he's encountered. So Jesus heads up the mountain and sits down with the disciples. The text tells us it's close to Passover. This is the second Passover that's mentioned in John's gospel. The first was back in chapter 2 when Jesus cleansed the temple. The third and final Passover will be at the events leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. Now, it's because John's gospel mentions these three Passovers that we understand Jesus' earthly ministry to have taken place over 3 years. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle/sign story that appears in all four Gospels. But there's a difference between how John tells this story and how Matthew and Mark tell this story. Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus had compassion for the people, and that's why he wanted to feed them. John doesn't mention anything about compassion. For John, Jesus wants to show people the power of God. The power of God to multiply resources in amazing ways. So for Jesus, this is an opportunity to show the power of God in John's gospel. So Jesus says to Philip, "Where can we buy bread so everyone can eat?" Now, the backstory here a little bit is Philip's a relatively local guy to where the scholars think Jesus was at this point. So Philip would be the one that would know where the stores were, if you will, where food could be bought. But John tells us that Jesus was testing Philip. Jesus knew already what Jesus was going to do. And Philip failed the test. Even with 6 months' wages, we couldn't buy enough bread for these folks to even have a slice, Philip says. So now what do we make of Philip? Now, like Bill, I've had the pleasure of planning chicken barbecues where we've expected to feed 700 or so people. So I understand the planning that goes into these types of events. Now, Jesus is talking about feeding somewhere 10 to 15,000 because remember, the 5,000 was just the men. We got to add the women and children in here as well. And they're on a mountain, and they did no planning. So now think about that. How many porta potties do you need for 10 to 15,000 people? How would you get them up that mountain? Not to mention all the food. So do we feel sorry for Philip? Or do we wonder why Philip, after seeing all those signs, starting at Cana, still doesn't get it? So then along comes Andrew. We got a boy over here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good will that do? So Andrew's a little better, but not much. Well, you heard. Jesus gave thanks for the fish and the bread and distributed it to the people, and everyone ate their fill, and there were 12 baskets left over. From the scarcity, God provided abundance. So now the people see this and say, hey, this is the prophet that Moses talked about. In Deuteronomy, Moses told the people, Yahweh, your God, will raise up to you a prophet from the midst of you, of your brothers like me. You shall listen to him. So the crowd says, hey, this is the prophet Moses was talking about. Let's make him king. The people wanted to institutionalize Jesus to serve in their own purpose. They wanted to make him king of their little area. Why not? He just fed 5,000 of them. Why wouldn't they want to make him king? Let him keep feeding them and keep taking care of them. Jesus said, no, that's not why I'm here. That's putting me in too little of a box. Jesus had a far greater purpose for these folks than being their earthly king. So Jesus hightails it up the mountain to get away, and I suspect to spend some time in prayer as well. The disciples head down to the sea and start across to Capernaum. Now, John tells us it was dark and they're about 3 to 4 miles out when the weather turns and the sea becomes rough. The disciples see Jesus coming and they were afraid. Now, it's interesting, in John's version of this, they're not afraid of the storm, they're afraid of Jesus. In Matthew and Mark's version, they think Jesus is a ghost. But in John's version, they know it's Jesus. Here, they knew it was Jesus, and it scared them. And Jesus said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And immediately, John borrowed that word from Mark, the boat reached the land where they were going. Two things. First, a little geography. Sea of Galilee is 8 miles wide at its widest point from east to west, and 13 miles at its widest point from north to south. So if they'd rowed 3 or 4 miles, they more than likely still had a ways to go. So scholars believe that immediately reaching land is the power of God at work, not an indication of how close they were to the shore when Jesus caught up with them. Second, it is I. When we hear that in English, we miss it. We don't understand the significance of what Jesus just said. The Greek is ego eimi, the words God used when Moses said, "Who should I tell the people sent me?" Jesus is telling the disciples two things. He is their leader they've been following since before Cana, but also he is the presence of God among them. So does darkness only mean lack of light? Does it only refer to nighttime? Or does darkness mean much more than that? And can Jesus show up in that darkness as well? Like many other places, it was dark in Origsburg that November. The housing crash had impacted many. Jobs were being lost. Residents were struggling to keep up with their mortgage payments. Earned income tax revenues were down. Our utility delinquencies were at an all-time high, and the food pantry was out of food and anticipating a record demand. In the darkness, we heard Jesus say, "Ego eimi, it is I, do not be afraid." And the scarcity became an abundance. Enough food was not only collected to meet the needs for the November distribution, but have the pantry well on its way for the pre-Christmas distribution, which was also anticipated to be another month with record demand. When Jesus fed the 5,000, he demonstrated that the world is filled with abundance and loaded with generosity. Jesus showed that if bread is broken and shared, there is enough for all. Jesus is countering scarcity and engaging in a subversive reordering of public reality. The myth of scarcity is the belief that there's not enough to go around. The rich stay rich, the poor stay poor. It's just the way it is, right? The vast majority of the world's resources continue to be disproportionately belong to an incrementally smaller percentage of the world's population. The gap between rich and poor in the U.S. is worse than during the Great Depression. It's easy to believe that resources are scarce unless we have some sense of justice, unless we see budgets and economics as moral discourse. As Jim Wallace says, a budget is a moral document. Friends, scarcity is not God's way. God's way is abundance. Brandon Rensher reminds us that creation came into existence through the generosity of a self-giving triune God. Each of us and all of creation mirrors God's generosity to give and to share. Is it dark now? While some may believe that poverty has mostly been defeated, the Pocono Mountain School District website tells us that around 430 students at TEC, 64% of the student body, are economically disadvantaged. There are around 590 students at the West Junior High and 1,200 students at the West High School who are economically disadvantaged. Almost 300 families come to the Five Loaf House every month for food and other grocery items. And now we're being asked to also help our siblings at the border with hygiene items and other supplies. Is it dark? Maybe it is. But it is in the darkness that we will see Jesus, and Jesus will tell us, "Ego eimi, it is I. Do not be afraid." Jesus is with us and leading us, and with Jesus leading us, that scarcity will become an abundance. Amen. Now, in body or in spirit, please rise for our closing.